Hi, everyone. I'm Asha Rangappa, and I am back with another Ask Asha. Today, I'm going to talk about the legal basis, or lack thereof, for Trump's tariffs, since they are back in the news and going to affect all of us. So, how is Trump actually doing all of this? How is he doing this global trade war? Well, it is perplexing. The Constitution, in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, gives Congress the power to regulate foreign commerce, and that would include the power to impose tariffs. Now, here's the thing. Congress has a lot of powers, but it can delegate authority to exercise some of those powers to the president within certain parameters. And this is because many things, like, for example, tariffs and sanctions and things, might be context dependent. They might depend on particular situations or foreign policy relations that Congress can't always anticipate ahead of time or legislate very broadly. And so Congress can say, in the case of X, Y, and Z situation, we give the president authority to basically do the thing that the Constitution gives us the power to do. And this happens in a lot of different contexts, including things like immigration. But right now, in terms of foreign commerce, this is the kind of delegation. This is called delegated authority. This is important because there are 6 statutory provisions that Trump could potentially invoke to impose tariffs. There's 5 statutes that literally explicitly talk about tariffs, but Trump has picked the one statute that doesn't mention tariffs at all. It's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, AIPA. So why did he choose AIPA instead of the other 5 statutes that actually give him explicit authority to impose tariffs? Well, those statutes require either some sort of factual finding which supports his need to impose these tariffs, or they impose a time limit on the tariffs that are imposed, or they impose a cap on the amount of a tariff that can be imposed. AIPA, by contrast, doesn't require any kind of factual finding. It doesn't have any time limit on the measures that are taken, and it doesn't have any cap. Again, AIPA doesn't actually mention tariffs, but we'll get back to that in a second. But you can see how that statute might be appealing. All that AIPA requires is that the president declare a national emergency. And once he does that, he is authorized to take measures to deal with that emergency. Now, an emergency, in the language of AIPA, is an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. So, in Trump's executive order, you might be asking, what is the national emergency that Trump is responding to? Well, he is responding to a persistent trade deficit that the United States has. Now, you can see that on its face, it's not exactly an unusual or extraordinary threat if something is persistent. In fact, the executive order in which Trump imposes these tariffs or claims the authority to do it acknowledges that we've had a trade deficit for decades. But that is the national emergency. Now, of course, in recent weeks, his rationale for imposing tariffs have come to include the fact that he doesn't think that Brazil should be prosecuting the former president for instigating a coup in that country, or that he doesn't like that Canada has recognized Palestine as a state, and he thinks that that warrants tariffs. And whatever you think about those issues in those respective countries, they're really not a national security threat to the United States. They certainly don't pose an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States, and they really have nothing to do with the national emergency or even the basis that Trump himself has claimed is the basis for his tariffs. So his tariffs are, in fact, now being challenged in court, including, by the way, by a conservative group. And the group that is challenging his tariffs are making 4 arguments. The first is that he is misusing AIPA, that it's not intended to be used as tariffs at all. Again, it doesn't mention tariffs. In fact, until Trump, no president had tried to use it for tariffs. He's the first one to try to do it. And so there's a question of whether the statute itself gives the authority to do this. And I think you can point to the fact that Congress has passed other statutes that actually mention it. So maybe by not mentioning it, it actually means something. There's also an argument that what Trump is doing violates something called the Major Questions Doctrine. The Major Questions Doctrine is that when something is deciding an issue of major political or economic significance, when the president is issuing, executive order that is doing something that has a huge impact, that if it's something that would ordinarily be in Congress's power, that it needs Congress's authorization. So one example of this is during the Biden administration, Biden wanted to institute loan forgiveness under statutory authorities like the HEROES Act, which gave him a lot of flexibility to act, again, in the case of a national emergency, in that case, COVID. The Supreme Court said, no. When you cancel loans, that's, a huge thing. That is basically has such a financial impact that that's a entirely new regulatory scheme. That's not something that Congress intended to do under the HEROES Act or any other statute. This requires congressional authorization. This is beyond the executive authority. And so the challengers are also making the case here that this is the same thing. There's also a challenge to the delegation of authority at all, that for Trump if Trump were to have this authority under AIPA, if the court says, well, no, we think the statute actually says that he can do this, that it violates the non-delegation doctrine, which is that Congress can delegate authority for the president to have flexibility or to act within certain parameters or criteria, but it can't just give him congressional powers wholesale. And that if Trump is simply able to impose tariffs all over the place to whichever country and in whatever amount for any length of time, that he feels like that is basically Congress giving up this entire power that is granted to that institution in the Constitution. So those are the core arguments that are being made by the challengers here. So you might be asking, well, what would be a situation where you would use AIPA? Well, AIPA was signed into law by President Carter in 1977, and it was actually first used in the Iran hostage crisis. And I teach this case where President Carter invoked AIPA to basically unfreeze Iranian assets that had been tied up in civil litigation by private actors as a part of his negotiations in order to release the American hostages. And I think that kind of gets to, both why Congress delegates authority and an appropriate use of it. We want the president to be able to act quickly, act in situations that, Congress is not going to be able to plan for in advance or even react to in that moment. If there's hostages there, Congress wasn't going to be able to pass a new law very quickly. So, you want the president to be able to act and use any tools that he can at his disposal to respond and protect American interests. And you want him to be able, the appropriate use of it is, as in that case, a very surgical tool to be able to offer some sort of economic incentive in order to get a very specific goal. Unfortunately, what we're seeing with the Trump administration in the tariff context, but in many other contexts as well, education, immigration, Trump is basically taking these delegated authorities and using them as sort of carte blanche to exercise Congress's power on his own, more or less. The good news here is that theoretically, if Congress wanted to, it could claw all of these authorities back. It could explicitly say that he's not able to do this. Unfortunately, right now, that looks unlikely to happen, but it is something to think about if and when we are finally on the other side of this administration. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.